In this podcast, Sally Johnston, Manager of Food and Beverage at MPI, discusses the philosophy and history behind the Food Act.
When the Act was built and it was decided that we wanted a risk and outcome-based Act, there was some initial work about essentially deciding which kinds of food businesses in New Zealand were considered riskier than others. And there's a whole bunch of information about that on our website, or I'm sure you can find it in lots of places, but the guts of it is the factors that were taken into consideration were things like whether or not the food supported the growth of bugs, whether or not there was quite a bit of information already around about the kinds of hazards found in food, so whether physical hazards were commonly found in foods of that kind, or whether there were particular chemical hazards to be worried about, or particular bugs were associated with that food. So that was one factor that was taken into account. Other factors included the intended purpose for the food, so whether it was intended to be served predominantly to vulnerable populations. There was also factors such as common size of businesses, and so whether or not businesses in that sector tended to serve many people or fewer people, and the impacts on society should that sector get stuff wrong. So for example, commodity foods that almost everybody eats, if they have a certain hazard type, they would be riskier than the same hazard in a food that is not consumed by very many people, just because fewer people are going to be exposed to that hazard. So all of those factors were taken into account. So a lot of the risk information that you need to be aware of is actually already in the Act, and that information was the basis of which decided which risk-based measure would apply to particular categories of food business. Then there is risk on a day-to-day basis. So when you walk into a food business, you will be able to look around and you'll be able to see lots of things that could affect food safety in that business. So I'm assuming that most of you as verifiers understand the difference between a hazard and a risk. If you don't, that would be a competency that we would suggest that you develop. But the guts of it is the hazard is the potential. So it is the thing that could make people sick. It's the bug or the chemical or the physical thing, the glass or the plastic or whatever it happens to be. So the hazard is the potential, and the risk is essentially a probability calculation. It's a calculation based on whether or not the hazard is reasonably likely to be there, and the severity of the consequences if it is there. So it's kind of a probability thing. And when you walk into a food business, you will likely see lots of hazards and lots of risks. And the temptation will be there to try and address every single one of them. But that's kind of not realistic, and it's overwhelming for everybody involved. I mean, if you had 53 corrective actions on a food business, then where do you start? Where does the food business start? Where do you start? Do you have to follow up on all of them? Do you have to, put in a massive action plan in place with the food business to, address every single one of those risks? And the answer is no. Some risks are low likelihood. They're not likely to happen very often. And so it's kind of, okay, they might be important, but there might be something more important. So it's really not so much about the presence of risk, but it's the prioritisation that you give to addressing a risk, or the prioritisation that you ask the business to have towards addressing a risk. So the top 5 factors are where we consider more risks are likely to occur in the food business, and where if verifiers spend most of their time, and food businesses spend most of their time getting those things right, then the overall weighting of risk in the sector will be managed well and will be lessened. So it's not about everything, it's about picking the things that make the most difference. In some cases, while we've come up with top 5 for pretty much all sectors, actually in some cases, we stopped at 4 or even 3, because actually we could pick stuff off a list, and for the purposes of national program guidance, that's essentially what we did. We just said, well, where there's a sector that really only has 3 major risks that we're worried about, we could say, well, for you there's a top 3, but for a cohesive set of guidance we said, well, there is only 3 for that sector, but it doesn't hurt if they also have these extra 2, but actually those extra 2 aren't going to give us a lot of bang for our buck. And similarly, you could walk into a business and you could come up with 10 risk factors, but at some point down the line, you're basically saying, well, whether they deal with them or not is unlikely to make a significant impact on the food safety. Obviously, we would like to think that we'll get to a point sometime in the future where all food businesses are managing food safety really well, and that they'll be managing more than 5 things really well. But at the end of the day, we're early in this new act. It's a big change for people, it's a massive change for people. 2 years ago, there are food businesses where the inspector would walk in once a year and do their floors, walls and ceilings and hand them a registration certificate and say, you're great, you're one of our best performers. And now that we've moved to risk and outcome-based rules, verifiers walking in and saying to this business that has always believed themselves to be a great performer in terms of food safety, actually you're a bit shit because you're not following these 63 rules that we've set. And it's demoralising, but also it's not actually really addressing the risk. All you're doing is you're depressing and overwhelming that food business, and you're not improving food safety. If they are starting with a great kitchen and your inspections have shown that they've been cleaning that kitchen pretty well in the times that you've been dealing with them, then instead of berating them for not having, records about the fridge temperature every single day, how about working with them to say, what are the risks that you really need to focus on now? And if it is temperature control, one way that you can demonstrate that you're in control of that risk is through your records. That might be one way of doing things, but it's also actually, are they not checking the temperature of the fridge, which is a bigger risk than not writing it down? So if they're checking and not writing it down, actually the food safety risk is managed. There's just an administration thing that's not being done. So again, it's about, using judgment, but educating and coaching food businesses about which risks are most important to them to manage, and not having a list a mile long, because that is just a big turn off for everybody. And the goal is to improve food safety, not to essentially make everybody in the system feel bad because they're not perfect. That's not what we're about. So that's, I guess, the philosophy of risk.